Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and in today's video we're going to take a look at the raid comps being used so far during the Race to World First. Here's a little picture of my predictions from a bit over a week ago, before anybody, of course, had entered the raid, which turned out to be pretty good. A couple of little mistakes in here. This little smug idiot behind me had a few things that he was wrong about, but mostly we got a lot of this right. So I made a little tweet. I looked through the top 7 guilds that were doing the Race to World First, and I looked at what their most recent comps were. And let's see, this is what that looks like here. So these are the comps. Ooh, the old Microsoft Paint resizer. Okay, it's getting a little pixely, but we're gonna make do. So this is my predictions over here, and then this is what people actually were using. These specs were the specs that every single guild of Method, Echo, Liquid, BDG, Instant Dollars, Skyline, and Fat Shark Yes, so top 7 guilds in the world pretty much, were using at the time that I looked at them. Now there has been some swapping around. We've seen stuff like the 3rd Beast Mastery Hunter being used on some fights and that kind of stuff, so there has been some swapping happening. But for the most part, let's go spec by spec and roll by roll and see how well we've been doing so far. So first off in the tanks, I was right on. Prop Paladin and Blood DK, very standard choices. The Prop Paladin, a very good way to bring that second Paladin aura, which is a big damage increase, right? Ret aura, which if it procs, is a 1.5% damage increase, although it can be a little hard to proc it on some fights actually, which is a little weird, but still very powerful, very strong effect, so that is good. And the Blood Decay also turned out to be strong, turned out to be a very solid choice. Farrak looks like a great encounter for Death Knights in general, but the DPS Death Knight specs are kind of mid, and Blood Decay has an extra advantage over the DPS Death Knight specs, actually 2 extra advantages, which is the, well, 3 really. 1, they don't lose as much damage holding A-Bomb Limb for whenever they want for utility. 2, they have Mass Grip if they want it. And 3, AMZ is more powerful on a Blood Decay than it is on the DPS DKs, so all of that makes the Blood Decay a very solid choice this time around. Now the Warrior, there has been a little bit of arms being used on some bosses, but Fury has been the main spec that we've mostly seen, and that is pretty much what we've seen out here in the race as well. So I'll give myself a little check mark on that one too. The 2 Augmentation Evokers, that has also been the meta by far. Everybody's been using 1. Everybody except for Fat Shark Yes was using 2 at the time that I looked at this. Echo also were dropping between 1 and 2. And BGG were even using a 3rd for a while. I'm not sure if they still are. But yeah, the 2 Augmentation Evokers has been the bog standard, which makes sense because that spec can apply. A character can have up to 2 Ebon Mites on them, which means that the 2 Augmentation Evokers are a lot better than the 3rd and the 4th. And they are still good enough, even post-nerf, to be a pretty common mainstay in these raids. Although I really don't think that you're missing out that much if you're outside of the Race to World First setting by not bringing them. The amount of optimization that they require, like the work that those Aug Evokers are doing to be buffing the right people to actually end up being worth, you know, that spot over another DPS option is not something that a lot of guilds are actually going to do with their Aug Evokers. And if that's the case, then it's a really marginal pick, and you definitely don't need to play Aug Evokers in the raid this tier. They've been nerfed enough that that is no longer the case outside of the Race to World First. Okay, melee side of things. The Double Havoc has also been the standard. Everybody except for BDG and Skyline was playing that second Havoc Demon Hunter, and of course everybody. I don't know how far down the list we'd have to look to find a guild not playing a second Havoc Demon Hunter, a first Havoc Demon Hunter. It'd be pretty far. There are some guilds actually further down the list that are using a Vengeance Demon Hunter. That kind of frees you up to not play one, but why would you want to? Havoc is fantastic. Havoc is just a great spec on its own merits, raid buff aside, but the first slot is just hard locked in due to that raid buff. The Double Rogue as well, I was correct on. Again, I kind of put 2 specs here because I said the Rogue specs are going to change. They'll play multiple of them. One thing I kind of missed was Subtlety was actually a spec that we've seen being used, especially Smolderon. It lines up really well with timings, but people were using it for some of Tindral progression as well, so definitely a spec to still factor in at the top tiers there. You know, again, I put 2 rogues and I picked 2 rogue specs. Outlaw is probably going to be a little bit less used than Sub and Sin when the dust settles here, but still I'm going to get myself check marks on those. The first Enhancement Shaman as well. That was also obviously good, right? That one's not a hard one to guess, right? Like, oh, they're bringing in Enhancement Shaman. Like, yeah, of course, they have more than 2 melee DPS. The Enhancement Shaman is giga worth it. One thing I didn't really catch was that almost everybody would bring a second Enhancement Shaman, so that was something that I don't know where I'll put my X. I guess the X here. Let's talk about the biggest mistakes on this list. The biggest mistake on this list is just the dev evokers. People ain't really using those. They are not as good as I thought they would be. They're not as prevalent as I thought they would be. I actually was pretty excited coming into like Tuesday and Wednesday because dev evokers were pumping in splits, but a lot of that came from the fact that their old set bonus was really good. Their new set bonus is not as good, which means that we get this situation where it's like, we don't really actually need this thing for Mythic Prog. We don't really need more copies of Evoker utility, and Dev Evoker just has less utility than Aug Evoker anyways. So the second two lizards are the things that I was most wrong about here. And one of those is usually an Enhancement Shaman in most of these comps that people are running. The demo lock. Yeah, I mean, demo is definitely the premier warlock spec. People are playing a little destro on stuff like council, but otherwise we are seeing demo all the way through, and we are seeing one warlock from pretty much everybody, although Fat Shark Yes was flirting with the second. The mage, we've also been seeing one mage from pretty much everybody. It's been, obviously you need to bring one, but the spec hasn't looked phenomenal enough or the class hasn't looked phenomenal enough to stack multiple ofs. Mostly we've been seeing them play Arcane, most fights. That is the one that is getting the most value, but arguments to be made for fire as well on some fights. I think that guilds reaching these bosses later should be playing probably more fire than the Race to World first were, and frost also on fights like Primal Council, or like, Council of Dreams, also makes some sense potentially too. The Hunters. Now, I was right that there would be a Hunter in every raid team, but the other kind of biggest, like the standard swap here for Dev would be 1 to Enhancement and 1 to Beast Mastery. That would, I think, get us closest to like the average comp that people are using. And the second Beast Mastery Hunter is definitely good. Beast Mastery Hunter, sort of like Havoc Demon Hunter. Like, yeah, you want to bring the first because it's got a pretty good raid buff. It's less good than the Havoc raid buff, but it's still a raid buff. But yeah, you just bring multiple. They're really sick. They do so much damage. The spec is really good. The class is strong. The defenses of Hunter are pretty well suited for this tier, actually. If you look at a fight like Mythic Tindral, Turtle being an immunity that doesn't remove the Dispel from you immediately is actually lines up really nicely on that fight, which is weird. Usually that's a drawback. But whether that kind of stuff aside, you'd just be bringing the Beast Mastery Hunters already because they do incredible damage, especially on fights like Tindral, where there's a lot of cleave you need to do sometimes, and also you need to be highly mobile while you're doing your damage, right? A lot of other specs get griefed by doing mechanics. Beast Mastery Hunters only get griefed if they get brain globaled, right? If you stop being able to do damage because you're overloaded on mechanics, but you're never actually unable to press your buttons and do a mechanic at the same time as a Beast Mastery Hunter. So once you've got your brain globals locked in, that spec works out really nicely on those super mechanically intense fights. Then the healing comp, I was also dead on here. Mistweaver, Double Disc, Holy. You know, the second priest is sometimes a Holy Priest as well, but I think I mentioned that even during this video. I was like, yeah, they'll swap between them, but I think that Disc is going to be the main one. And Mistweaver, the best way to get the Mystic Touch buff. Also, something to talk about with the two Priest and the Mistweaver is that the Ablaze debuff on Farak, at least on the Heroic and Normal, is something that Mass Dispels and Revival line up really nicely against. I suspect on Mythic that will also be tremendously valuable power brought by those classes. So I think this healer comp is definitely going to be a very standard one among like the Hall of Fame level of guilds. It's definitely worth noting that for both tanks and healers and for DPS, although I think for DPS it's actually maybe even a little bit less true, but especially for tanks and healers, the options that you're not seeing in this comp list are still very good. Things like Vengeance Demon Hunter, very strong tank. Absolutely, powerhouse of a tank, has a lot of really good stuff going for it. Resto Shaman, Prez Evoker, which BDG even were using, but they were the only guild in the top 7 to be doing it. Those sorts of classes are not bad at all. They are definitely good, and guilds will succeed at clearing this raid in the world top 20, in the world top 100, using some amount of those specs. It's this comp has been pretty homogenized by the top few guilds, where again, if we see, this is sort of what the top 7 were running when I looked at it, and they agreed on 15 of the 20 spots, and then there was some minor disagreements about those remaining 5 slots, although a lot of these are like everyone except 1 or 2 guilds. But I do think that guilds that deviate from this comp are not going to be punished for it, which is a much more important thing when we look at class balance than is there a dominant comp, is how much do you get punished by deviating from the dominant comp? And I don't think the answer is going to be too much this tier, which is really good. There have been some previous tiers, for instance, where if you're missing that Disc Priest, you can't play the game, and that is a really sucky thing to have happen. Of course, you need to find a way to bring your raid buffs in, but if you want to do it in a slightly different configuration, that is, I think, going to work out this tier, which is nice. And then finally, the Druid. The Balanced Druid has been the premier Druid spec that is like more guilds are using, but I think it's worth giving myself like a, like a dash on this one. It's not really a check, not really an X, because yeah, balance has been pretty common. A lot of people have used balance, but I did certainly miss that Feral Druid was going to be a really powerful choice this tier. Liquid and Echo have been using it to tremendous effect on Smolderon. They've been using it for Tindral pulls as well. That is a spec that has phenomenal burst AoE on demand. It's really good for the Tindral roots. And also their CD timings line up really nicely on Smolderon as well, I believe, is part of the reason that you're seeing them play that. And also just, yeah, I mean, the specs, it's just good this tier. It's a good spec. I suspect that guilds that have a Feral Druid player, both of those guilds, will have their druids allowed to play Feral instead of forced to spec balance this tier, which is also great. That's a really good place to be. But guilds that just have a balanced druid will not. I don't think anybody's going to feel obligated to have their balanced druids play Feral if they don't want to on fights like Smolderon and Tindral by the time they get there, which again, that's a great place to be, right? That sort of level of flexibility is a pretty good place to be. For me personally, my guild is running this comp, except we've dropped the Dev Evokers. We were going to have one and maybe two, but I ended up having like one of them have IRL stuff going on anyways. The other one we're hot swapping to Beast Mastery. And then the other Dev Evoker slot, we've got a Shadow Priest in there, which is also something that is fine. The damage numbers for it individually look pretty low, but when you factor in the power infusion, it's definitely doing fine. And then the other thing we've changed about this comp is we have currently got a Frost DK, but looking at this comp, I can't see what we replaced for it. One dev to Beast Mastery, one dev to Shadow, and then we changed something to a Frost DK as well, which, yeah, I'm not sure. It's not the second Havoc Demon Hunter. It's not the second Rogue. It's not the Enhanced Shaman. I don't know. Somehow we've fit a 21st person in that's a Frost DK, so that's pretty cool, I guess. We've got some big hacks going on. Anyways, yeah, it's a cool tier. The raid comps are pretty fun this tier. I'm pretty happy with my ability to read the meta going into this tier. There's been some tiers where I've missed much more. I've been much farther off the mark than this. There's been some tiers where I've shown up playing Guardian Druid and Sanctum and thinking it was going to be good, and it was not very good. And I mean, it was okay, but it was a miss, right? And this time around, I feel like I hit pretty well on these things. So don't expect it to be this good usually. I think this was an above average set of predictions for me. But anyways, I hope you found this video interesting. I hope you found the original raid comp video interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.